Good evening, everyone. My name is Zhi Fong. I'm a general surgery chief resident at Massachusetts General Hospital, and I'll be moderating the session today. Welcome to the Society for Surgery of the Elementary Tracts webinar on tips for virtual interviewing. Given that the upcoming residency interview season will be virtual, and that most fellowship interview cycles are presently virtual as well, we hope to provide some perspective from both sides as the interviewee and the interviewer. We'll proceed with the panel presentations and then we'll leave the Q&A to the end of the session. But if the audience have any questions at any point, please type it into the chat box and we can get to them during the Q&A. So our first panelist is Dr. Sophia McKinley, who is also my fellow chief resident and a future surgical oncology fellow at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Dr. McKinley is an accomplished and funded surgical educator. She has an education policy master's with over 40 publications and chapters to her name. She has won teaching awards at every possible level and more recently published in Annals of Surgery on successful virtual interviews this year and has since garnered an out metric of 56. Today, she'll be providing us her perspective from the applicant's viewpoint. Sophia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Fong. Let me get my slides up. Great. So I want to thank the SSAT so much for the chance to be a panelist on this important topic. I'm a chief resident at MGH, and I will be presenting the applicant's perspective on pearls and pitfalls of the virtual interview. I know that it's going to affect thousands of students across many fellowships, as well as the residents applying for surgical training programs. I have no disclosures. So I do want to disclose, however, that all the information I'm providing is purely experiential. It has no research base or evidence to support it. This is a picture of me doing my first surgical oncology fellowship interview, actually. It was for MD Anderson, so, you know, no pressure at all. But my husband was really delighted that he was able to kind of see this important professional milestone for me. So he took this picture, and you can see what my setup was. I borrowed these lights from my brother-in-law, propped my laptop up on a textbook, and my cat is actually just out of view in this picture. I really want to provide reassurance to applicants about the virtual interview process. I did 14 virtual interviews for surgical oncology fellowship, and I really believe that standard interview preparation will get you 95% of the way to a strong interview performance. The final 5% involving webcams, microphones, all of that is really just the fine details. And I also really want to reassure applicants that it is possible to convey all of your strengths and accomplishments, what your career vision is, and even your personality across a virtual platform. Two things that I will not be discussing today is how to get screened into an interview offer and making a rank list, although I have many thoughts about those things as well. So the first interview pearl that I want to present is about physical comfort. I think at this point, we all realize how physically straining virtual meetings are. And I would say that my number one regret of my fellowship interview process was that I did not invest in a comfortable chair. I think that you really want to think about your physical comfort and how all of your mental energy can be devoted to your actual interview performance. So other things to think about are the ergonomics of your workstation, making sure you have ready snacks, coffee, water, getting up and stretching, whatever you need to do. I'd say one advantage of the virtual interview is that you get to control your interview space. So for example, you get to control the food you eat versus being subject to the airport, and I wore slippers during my interviews. So I guess that's one positive. One thing that's really unusual about virtual interviews is that there's a screen between you and the interviewers. So in a lot of ways, you're actually acting as the best version of yourself because you have to convey yourself through a camera. And you really need to test the technology that will convey the digital version of yourself. Things to think about are lighting your face evenly, making sure your audio quality is good. All of your devices should be plugged in so you don't run out of battery. And then if you live with other people who are going to be using the internet at the same time, think about how many people will be doing video interviews or video meetings at the same time so that you have good internet quality. And then finally, it's really important to think about silencing all of your alerts on your computer as well as on your phone. My final pearl for the virtual interviews is to really invest in time for self-reflection. And I would challenge you to think about who you are as an applicant and where you're going. And I think if you can answer those questions well, coherently, that will go a really long way in your virtual interview performance. This is interview preparation regardless of the platform, but I think it's really critical. I have some day of tips, which is just to think about all of the small details that'll give you a smooth interview day. It's really important to print the interview schedule for yourself and instructions about backup technologies. Who do you call if your video interview fails? A lot of times you'll get the schedule in advance so you can actually plan your snacks and meals. And then finally, spend some time reading about programs and thinking about what you need to gain from the interview day yourself. So have some questions prepared that are pertinent to the actual programs that you're going to be interviewing with. It shows that you've done your homework and that you have interest in that program. And then one thing I did, which was really useful, is I actually tested how I could take notes during the virtual interview. So where would I keep my notebook and my pen, and what kind of screen capture could I use on silent, no shutter sounds, to be able to screenshot the PowerPoints that program directors would have, and then I wouldn't have to try to write down all of the fine details. That will make your interview day a little smoother. I do think one pitfall of the virtual interview is that it's really easy to get distracted on a screen, and you want the interview's attention all on you. So consider your background. You don't want to have dirty laundry on your bed in the background or distracting posters. Also think about the noise levels. You want obviously a quiet environment, and then think about pets or children who are around. I think if you don't have suitable space in your home, that's really a good time to ask a faculty member or your institution if there's office space that you can use, because you wouldn't want to, when I think about when the interviewers talk about applicants, you want them to talk about you and your accomplishments and not kind of how cute your cat is, although, my cat is extremely cute. And then finally, I think it's really important not to underestimate standard interview preparation. So do a mock interview, make sure you're wearing appropriate attire, be familiar with your CV, and then learn about the programs that you're interviewing so you can ask intelligent questions. And then this isn't really about conveying your best self, but it is a tip for applicants, which is I think every applicant needs to, as part of the self-reflection process, think about what's important to you from an in-person interview that would get lost in the virtual setting. For some people, weather really matters. It doesn't matter to me, obviously, I live in Boston. But for other people, it's a really important part of their life. For other people, the restaurant scene or the kind of outdoors activities or the program culture, things that you learn about in person that are much more difficult to ascertain from a virtual interview. And so one piece of advice for applicants is you don't want to finish the interview day and realize that you haven't inquired about those things or you don't have a plan for how to gain that information so that you can make your rank list concordant with what your values are. As Dr. Fong mentioned, some of the MGH chief residents who had a spring fellowship cycle did kind of collect all of our thoughts together, and we made a long list of applicants, including a checklist for you for your interviews. I think it's a very helpful article and certainly covers more than I'm able to share in this brief talk. I'm looking forward to your questions. I'm happy to respond by email or by Twitter. And again, I just want to thank the SSAT for this opportunity and really encourage applicants that you will be able to convey your best self in the virtual interview setting.
Thank you, Dr. McKinley, for the great talk and really good slides. I remember Dr. McKinley giving me a tip that wearing glasses might be distracting especially because you see the glare in my eyes right now, and that can take away from the attention from your interview, which I conveniently forgot and ignored during this session. Our next speaker, Dr. Ryan Day, is presently an abdominal transplant fellow at UCSF after having completed a complex general surgical oncology fellowship at MD Anderson. He's destined to be the next great transplant oncologist with the best fellowships under his belt. He has over 25 publications and sits on committees at every institution he's been at. I met Dr. Day on the surgical oncology interview trail when he was the admin fellow for MD Anderson, having organized the night before event, and I thought it was one of the more organic and engaging sessions of the season. He has also recently published his program's perspective and experience in annals of surgery, and will be speaking to us from the program's perspective. Ryan?
Hi, everyone. Just going to set up my screen here. So we'll be talking a little bit about the virtual interviews and what the program's perspective is. You know, you just heard from Dr. McKinley, who I thought did a great job. And the photo she showed you interviewing at MD Anderson was actually the one that I helped set up. So a little bit of the timeline that we had when we went through this at MD Anderson. On March 9th, we announced restrictions on travel and visitors, including interviewing, implemented at MD Anderson. I happened to be at AHPBA at that very time, so I ended up giving presentations for a lot of my co-fellows who couldn't make it out to Miami. But in the next couple of days, we had to turn around and organize a completely virtual interview process for 24 applicants to the Complex General Surgical Oncology Fellowship. So that 5-day turnaround, we were able to get the first virtual interview together of any fellowship or residency last year, to my knowledge. And then with that turnaround, we came up with some best practices that we've been able to disseminate through our publication in the Annals of Surgery that programs can look at when they're setting things up. So the way we set things up was, in the beginning, we set a test session for the applicants before any of our program, where applicants could connect to the system that we had designated, which was similar to this, like a Zoom. And everyone was able to test their microphones, their cameras, their sound, and they were able to see if they were able to hear us from the program side as well. I think as programs are implementing these things, it's of vital importance that you attend each one of those at the programs that you're applying to, in order to make sure that there's no problems with the interface between your equipment and the equipment of the program that you're interviewing at. It should also give you some time to troubleshoot any issues that become apparent or make backup plans. So when we set things up, we also had backup phone numbers and FaceTime for applicants. So if there were problems with connections or any of the equipment, we had a backup plan that we could go to. And we did have to use that for several applicants during our interview session. Then on the first day, we had presentations on our program, which were administered by our current fellows. And this was a lot of the things that the applicants missed out on not being there in person. So it was about the climate and, you know, the sports teams and everything you could do in the city, and then kind of the academic track of the program at MD Anderson. And then we had everyone meet with our current fellows. So this is the one area that we really balked a little bit on doing in a socially distanced format for our current fellows at MD Anderson at the time. And we took our fellows and sat them in a room together, and then got everybody on the Zoom from the applicant side. And we were able to have kind of a big meeting where everyone was able to talk freely. There were no faculty present, and we were able to go back and forth. And I think as you look at programs, definitely look at the ones that allow you this organic time with the current residents, fellows that are at the program, and allow you to discuss things that maybe the faculty wouldn't know about or wouldn't disclose necessarily. So similar to interviewing in person, when you go to that dinner the night beforehand with the current residents and they kind of tell you what actually happens with the program, it's important to see that programs that you're looking at are replicating that experience in the virtual format. And then we had a virtual tour afterwards. It's a little different than actually being there, in that you see some different things within the hospital in the virtual tour. Sometimes I actually think it's a little bit better because everything doesn't have to be physically connected on a 20-minute tour or something like that. But it also allows you less time to talk with, say, the resident that's leading the tour or other people that are on it with you. So you may have less opportunities in that format to come up with and generate questions for later in the interview. For that reason, I want to echo what Dr. McKinley was saying. It's important to do your research on programs before you apply and have well-formulated questions going into the day. And then on our second day of the interviews, we had our one-on-one or one-on-two interviews with faculty. And then each applicant also interviewed with the surgical chair and the program director. I think these were largely similar to what we do for in-person interviews. The one thing I would say is the conversation can be a little bit more stilted in a virtual format. The call and response is not as immediate, and you have that artificial layer of the screen that's in front of you. So definitely be prepared to carry the conversation a little bit or get on to a new topic, and don't be afraid to, really let your personality show in that environment, because some of the people that are interviewing you will be just as inexperienced with this virtual format as you, and may even be more inexperienced with it once you've gone through a couple of these. So just to give you an idea of what the programs are looking at on interview day, this was the schedule I put together for our interviewers and interviewees at MD Anderson. So if it seems like things are hectic when you're interviewing somewhere or things are not running exactly on time, know that there's a lot of moving parts from the program side, whether it's the program coordinator, director, or the residents and fellows that are helping out with things. And you may feel frustrated from your end, but believe me, it's frustrating on the other end as well. And none of that blame is being placed onto applicants when things don't work out exactly right. And I think programs are very willing to make accommodations if you didn't meet an interview or something happened. Making it up on the back end can be done, especially in this virtual format when you're not traveling to somewhere during the actual portion of the day. One thing I did want to mention is several programs for residencies, for instance, are doing virtual meet and greets before even formal interviews. I think this is a good way to keep to show programs that you have interest with them. Mass General has done this virtual sub-internship. Other groups, including where I did my residency at Mayo, Arizona, and where I am now at UCSF, have these virtual formats for town halls. And it's a great way to show your interest in addition to submitting your application, because I do know at several of these, they are recording who comes and who's interested and who can go that extra little bit in order to find out about the program. It can also be a source of question generation for when you're interviewing at the program as well. Just some general tips: be kind to the coordinators, the fellows, the resident, the faculty, the janitors, anyone that anyone is putting you in contact with, whether it's by email before the interview, if it's during the interview, during an informal portion of the interview. You never know who's in that room and who has what say at an individual institution. Sometimes the coordinator has been there 30 years and is largely responsible for making suggestions about who the best fits for the program's culture and those sorts of things. So don't ever be short, snippy. You always have to have on your game face with anybody from the program and in any format. Definitely test your equipment beforehand, like we talked about before, whether that's through program testing sessions. Use the most redundant and reliable sources. So instead of Wi-Fi, use an Ethernet cord if you can. Instead of using your cell phone, use a landline if you have access to one. And then always have backup and redundancy plans. Again, to echo what Dr. McKinley said, we had several people who reached out to us in the beginning of this process and said, I don't have a space within my home. I have children, or we're in a shared situation, or there's just something, I don't have good internet at home. Most people were able to reach out to their current programs if they were interviewing for fellowship, or to their medical schools in order to provide them with a space and the means that they needed in order to successfully go through the interview process. And then definitely research the people in the program beforehand. Simply talking to faculty about their research that you've seen published, if you have genuine interest in that, or facets of the program that you're interested in, just shows your level of engagement and willingness to go that extra mile, especially when you're not flying out and that doesn't dedicate a certain amount of interest right off the bat. It's important in the virtual format that you show you've put in that extra little bit. And then the setup and follow through. You want to be intentional about where you're sitting. I think it's fine to have a plain wall behind you. There's nothing wrong with that. We had plenty of people with that. Some people like to do a more staged area. Like you saw, Dr. McKinley had books behind her. It would not be uncommon to be asked about those books during the interview. It comes off as a little bit odd when someone has staged books behind them, and then they can't answer questions about those books or talk intelligently about them. So make sure there's something that you really want to convey in yourself if you're going to stage the area behind you. Remember that you do want to dress formally. You want to wear, your jacket, your shirt, your tie, your formal wear. You also want to wear pants. I've heard a horror story already about someone on the interview trail who asked someone to stand up who was interviewing, who is not wearing formal pants. And even though that's nothing I would do or suggest that programs can do, it's something that you should be aware of and wear pants. You're interviewing the programs as well. Make sure you have intelligent questions. Make sure you discern the things that you need to know about the program. Particularly in the virtual format, there's less opportunities to ask those questions and get them in. When I was interviewing, sometimes by the end of the first, dinner, you felt like you had every question answered. You're going to have less opportunities just to formally chit chat with people. So definitely prioritize your questions and figure out what's important to you. Ask for help, whether that's from your med school or from your residency, or even from your spouse in both defining that space or finding what technically works the best for you. Sometimes you can have a friend, somebody else, set up a Zoom session in a different place and tell you how your lighting is, how your voice sounds, what your look like in your staging area. That's all important. Another way to demonstrate your interest to the programs is follow-up communication. I've talked to a number of people about this. At this point, no one cares if it's a physical letter versus an email. I have had no one I have ever talked to in the last 5 years tell me that they prefer getting an in-person physical thank you card as opposed to an email. So I think it's perfectly acceptable for you to demonstrate interest by sending thank you emails to the program. And usually you can send those to the coordinator of whichever program, and they can disseminate them within the program for you. And then have mentors reach out to the programs as well as another way of demonstrating interest and someone that's willing to advocate on your behalf. But all of these require thoughtful, planned, and intentional follow through on your part as the applicant to the program, especially in a virtual removed format. All right, it's good talking to you all, and I'll be happy to take any questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Day. Wear pants will be one of the most profound advice that Dr. Day can impart on anyone listening in the audience today. Last but not least, our final panelist, Dr. Allan Tsung, who really needs no introduction. He's a division chief of surgery oncology at the Ohio State University Medical Center and the program director for the fellowship program as well. He has published over 240 manuscripts and presently holds 2 active R01 grants from the NIH, amongst others. He was the past president of the Society of University Surgeons and holds leadership roles in the Society of Surgical Oncology, Society of Asian Academic Surgeons, the HPBA, and AASLD. I've known Dr. Tsung throughout the years, very different roles in societies, and I very much look up to him as someone I aspire to be like when I grow up, and the consummate leader and academic sponsor for all the aspiring academic surgeons out there. Today, he will talk to us about his perspective on the virtual interview as a program director.
Well, thank you, Z. That was really too kind. I just want to thank you, LK, and all the SSAT for putting together this great webinar. So this is actually an important and fun topic for me to talk about, since I can share my experiences from 2 different viewpoints. First, as someone who has actually gone through many interviews myself, from residency, fellowship, job searches, but now as positioned, as a fellowship program director and division chief, being on the other side of the table, interviewing for fellowship and job applicants. I have no disclosures. So if you've taken out time this Wednesday evening to attend this awesome session put on by Z and SSAT, you're probably getting ready for the interview season. And I'm going to try to answer the following questions based on my observations and personal experiences. The first is, probably the most important thing on your mind during this webinar is getting tips on how do you nail your interviews. And to get help to answer that, you need to understand what the other side is actually seeing. What are we looking at in selection of our candidates? Finally, you also want to know if the program you're interviewing with has the best environment to develop you. And from the program side, I need to make sure that we highlight our program so you know that. And finally, are all these questions, like how are they affected now that interviews are all virtual? All of you have worked pretty hard to get to where you are now. Getting an interview is already difficult enough. The reality is that no matter how talented or productive you are, matching into the top programs on your rank list is pretty difficult. There's no such thing as being a top candidate, just like there's no top program. There are many great candidates out there with different qualities, and there are many great programs, each of them having different things that we're looking for as well. However, the COVID pandemic threw a wrench in everything, as now you have one more variable to consider with all the interviews being virtual. So the main question I'm going to try to help you answer today is, how do you increase your chances of success in the virtual setting? And what I believe the answer is that to be able to leverage all the resources, including understanding how a program sees you virtually. So let's start. My first perspective from the program side is that nothing has really changed. Yes, many things around us have been affected due to the pandemic, and people keep saying, oh, we're living in an unprecedented time. But in terms of considering your interviews, what actually has changed besides not having to spend all this money to travel? Think about that. As an applicant, what you've done in your career thus far and what has fueled your career goals to apply for the next position has not changed. Also, the program characteristics you're applying to, that really shouldn't have been affected. And the questions you and your program have about each other to determine if the two of you are the right fit have not changed either. But most importantly, I think what others have said is that the interview process and the tips you should know by now definitely have not changed. Practice and prepare for it. Develop a connection with the interviewer. Do your homework. Get ready ahead of time. Stay relaxed. These are all things that unchanged, whether it's in person or a virtual interview. So what has been affected with interviews being virtual now? So this leads me to my second perspective. The selection is, I think, more difficult virtually from both sides, from both you as the applicant as well as me from the program side. As I mentioned, every one of you are different people and thus have different qualities that you want from a program. And similarly, each program is distinct and prioritize different things in selection of their candidates. It's all about finding the right fit for each other. To better explain myself, I think I probably want to give you some insight into how, in terms of my program, and I think other programs, their selection process. I think this is pretty similar at most institutions and similar no matter whether you're applying for residency, fellowship, or a job. First of all, as everyone knows, we receive many applications. And then, we have this pre-interview scoring where we incorporate, your test scores, whether you're AOA, what school you're coming from, all the accomplishments, awards, letter of recommendations. And then everyone puts together this initial rank list. And then you have the interviews. And then after each interview, the committee gets together and then we adjust the different, the rank list accordingly. And finally, right before the match, there's all this behind the scenes lobbying, people calling, different places to advocate for the mentees. And finally, we come out with a final rank list. But which part of this process do you think is actually the most important? Well, to me, I believe the interviews are actually the most crucial in decision-making. It's not just the actual interviews, but what was said before is actually the FaceTime with the residents, fellows, faculty at the program you're applying to. Well, for example, the biggest loss, I think, is actually the dinner reception the night before. It's actually difficult enough to try to get to know a person within a brief time. It's exponentially harder virtually. So why is seeing how people interact with you and others so important? When you actually start applying for residency and beyond, you're actually applying for a job where there's going to be a lot of person-to-person interactions. You could be a genius, but that doesn't mean you're going to be the person we want taking care of our patients, operating with, and entrusting our patients to. What we're looking for is to find candidates that we enjoy being around 24/7 for multiple years. In addition, your co-resident fellows will potentially be lifelong friends and colleagues. So this is a picture of Ohio State, Sir John Fellows reunions last year before, all things became virtual, where many of them are still very close to each other. My third perspective from the program side is that misconceptions are much more common. And what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. So you can get a misconception of the institution itself that you're applying to. For example, when I was interviewing for, division chief here at Ohio State, I've never been to Columbus, I've never been to Ohio State. You may think that the building where you work, the ORs, your call room, et cetera, they're all the same, but that's actually not true. They actually can be a big factor for your wellness, but also a surrogate of, the resources that this institution has. So here you see, two pictures. Here's one of the original James Cancer Hospital at Ohio State, and the new one they built in 2015. But if you're not physically here, all you see is images on a website. However, being here for interview, I was like thoroughly amazed at sort of the new cancer center building. It's like 1 million, square feet glass building costing $1 billion to build. But what you also don't see is all the construction of new buildings happening around the medical center. So there are many things about the program, about its growing and growing at an amazing pace that you just have no sense from a website. Similarly, when I went to Columbus to interview here, I thought Columbus was like a college town centered around Ohio State football. However, when I actually visited Columbus, the city, I realized that Ohio State is just a fraction of the city's economy. Columbus, the 14th largest city in the U.S. There's just a few of the companies. What I have here is just a few of the companies that are started and headquartered in Columbus, from insurance, retail, fashion, food, technology. So I know most of you guys probably don't prioritize the city or the area in the US where the program is located, but it actually is another important factor that can influence your personal life and ultimately wellness. And not being able to actually go there in person, you don't get a good sense of where you could be living for many years. So there can also be misconceptions in the program's emphasis on having a diverse team. So this is a picture of some of the leaders at the Ohio State Cancer Center where I work. And this is where you find on the website. And this is actually a fun collage put together by one of my faculty of our division's clinical faculty. As you can see, what I'm most proud of this program is that we're a very diverse group in terms of gender, ethnicity, age, personality. It's very difficult to get this sense during virtual interviews when you don't have a chance to meet everyone and you're just depending on a website. And finally, my last perspective from the program side is that putting forward your best foot takes a lot more time in the virtual setting. This is not just for you as the applicant, but I've just realized that it takes so much more time trying to get it right in organizing and showcasing our own programs. We're more than half a year into our lives where things are being done virtually. So in the first set of virtual interviews, when it first started, you could probably get away with glitches and mistakes interviewing. However, now there's really no excuse to not being prepared and getting it right. So I just want to end with some tips that have already been mentioned, but I think are important enough that you see that this is important to remember during your virtual interviewing. So first is you want to practice on a platform if you haven't been on it. Every platform is different, whether it's Teams, whether it's Zooms or something else, and you don't want to be fumbling around during your interview day. Also, as mentioned earlier, be early and test the sound. Not being able to hear the other person or what you are saying is disastrous. Also, clear up distractions, both auditory and visual. Don't do this in a call room with people walking around behind you. During the interview, so I had interview season, I had one applicant who was in their living room. They had a cat walking behind them, going back and forth. They didn't even know about it. It was actually pretty distracting. Also, be careful. You have what you have for your backgrounds. I know some people like those those backgrounds you can get online, but sometimes if you go in and out of these backgrounds, you look like a ghost. Another thing that's hard to do that I even have problems with is look at the camera entire time, depending on where you have your camera. It's still hard because you tend to look at the square where the other person is, but that's usually not where the camera is. And finally, as Ryan has said, you want to dress appropriately. Just because it's virtual, this is still a very formal occasion. Dress professionally. You also want to avoid Zoom fatigue. Everyone, I think all of us that have been meeting after meeting virtually, you realize you get more tired throughout the day. But what you want to try to work on is make sure your energy level does not go down noticeably over the interview day. And finally, send a handwritten note, thank you note. To me, I think it's important to send whether electronic email or a handwritten note. But with a virtual setting, I think it does go a long way for remember you if you send out like a handwritten note. And just one last tip. So just relax, even when there are glitches. If you know me, I always try to prepare for everything. I love this quote from Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And this is exactly what happened during, our second set of virtual interviews this year. The first one we already had some technical issues, so I thought we had it all fixed. But then during sort of initial introductions to my, during the second interview time, my computer suddenly froze. This is like right when I was introducing myself to all the applicants, and I had to reboot my computer. Then in the middle of the interviewing, the fire alarm, which is actually very loud in my room and high pitch, went off for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear anything. So things just happen. Just roll with the punches and stay relaxed. People notice those, who are cool under pressure. It's another important quality, especially if you're thinking about being a surgeon. I just want to thank Z and SSAT for just inviting me for this wonderful webinar as well.
Thanks for a great talk, Dr. Song. We'll promptly move ahead to the Q&A section of the webinar, seeing that we don't have a lot of time left and there are a couple of questions in there. I guess this would be open up. This can be open to all three of you. Alvin had a question about how you would be using the virtual hangout session as part of your program's evaluation. Is it a casual format where it's purely down to mingling with the fellows and the residents and the applicants, or is it also a secondary means of assessing the residents, the prospective resident or fellows fit with the program?
So in both the residency and fellowship interviews that I've been a part of setting up, we didn't use the hanging out with current trainees and asking informal questions. It was not a formal part of the evaluation process. A lot of times on the back end, the one-on-one interviews and faculty have a numerical system that go into them and that sort of thing. But with hanging out with the trainees, there was no formal system. But I will say that over time, people do present red flags in that format about themselves. I've had people talk about drug use and other things in that format that would still be considered by the program. You don't want to do anything that would count against you in that format.
I couldn't agree anymore. So we actually have all our fellows interviewing and being part of our sort of like, our rank list decision. I think it's important for each applicant to get a sense of the group that they're going to be potentially working with, but at the same time we are also trying to make sure that the applicant is a good fit for our program as well. So the people, even though there's no faculty there, how you interact with the current residents or faculty, it does come back to the final rank list, and we can decide is this the person or right fit for us.
And Osei had a question about, I think he wants to get an insight as to how you view the interview section of the part of the application. So for Dr. Song and Dr. Day, what are some of your more commonly asked questions? And I guess from your perspective, what is the most important question that which response you're looking for by which you would judge an applicant? And Dr. McKinley, which question did you think was the most important and most impactful question that you responded to throughout your experience in the interview trail?
So I think the one question that always seems to surprise people, and I'm always amazed that sometimes people don't have a better answer to, is for residency, why do you want to be a surgeon? Or for fellowship, why do you want to be a surgical oncologist or whatever you're going into? Routinely people stutter and kind of make their way through that with some variation. I want to help people, and it doesn't come off well like you've given a lot of thought to why you want to be involved in this profession that takes lifelong dedication. So I think if you had to practice one answer and have a solid answer to a single question, that's the one I would work on the most, and it's going to be the one that comes up probably the most frequently in your process.
We divide it a little differently. We have, just like most other programs, they have different rooms. But when they come to my room, the most important question that I'm going to be asking is, what kind of impact do you want to have in the future? I think, for all of us that are, applying for sort of like academic programs, it depends on, what program, priorities are. But for me, it's about, what kind of impact can you have in the future? And it's not about, number of, paper you've done, or, I want to know, what do you plan on doing with what you've done already, and how are you going to make our program, proud and even better than it is right now?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that you posed to me. What is the most powerful question I got? I certainly got a lot of, why do you want to be a surgical oncologist? Or, what do you see where your career is going to take you in 5, 10, 20 years? Or, what do you view your contribution to surgery? And I think every applicant needs to be ready to answer those questions. And if you can't answer those questions, I think you're going to have a hard time succeeding in the virtual interviews or in the in-person interviews. I did have a couple of moments where I felt that I received something from my interviewer, and that the interview wasn't just about me talking about myself, which it can end up feeling like for hours and hours. And I remember the interviewer, and I remember the institution very well. And it wasn't a specific question. It was really just his sincere curiosity and genuine interest in what would give me career satisfaction in the long run. And it's actually a little bit different than, where do you see yourself in 20 years, or what is your research portfolio going to include? And I really remember that interview very fondly, because it showed, and it reflected so well on that institution, because I thought, here is somebody who takes just this incredible human interest in me. Out of 20 applicants, can you imagine what it would be like to be this person's fellow? So I think that was a very powerful moment for me.
Thanks, Dr. McKinley. And I think, to finish off, this might be a more difficult question, but I think one question that most applicants typically have is that it's difficult enough getting a sense of the culture of the program and the fit, even when interviews were in person. How did you overcome that, and what were the barriers, and how do I get a better sense now that it's virtual? And maybe Dr. Song and Dr. Day can chime in on their perspective on how they can better help applicants figure out if they're a good fit for their programs.
Yeah, I think about this question a lot, and I would say it's kind of the primary concern I had about the virtual interview process. I actually think for applicants, like, the thing you should be worried about should not be like, how can I convey my accomplishments or my personality? I actually suspect that the programs get a pretty good sense of who the applicants are and their strengths, and even if they view that person as fitting into their culture, because the program is already an expert in their culture and who would do well in that program, and what are the traits that they're looking for people to be successful in their program. So I actually think that direction of communication is probably largely preserved in this format. My greatest concern was that the rank list I would have made in an in-person cycle, would that rank list be different from the rank list I made in this virtual interview cycle? And that's the kind of anxiety that I had. And this is why I tell everyone that you need to learn or think about what's important to you, because it's going to be different for everybody. And you need to have your list of what you're looking for in a program and what's going to make you succeed and give you well-being and resilience in a 7-year general surgery residency. And then if the program doesn't provide that information during the interview day, ask them about those things. You can't ask them about those things if you don't know what those things are. And then I really worked my network extensively. I talked on the phone to people that I had never met to try to understand what programs were like and to address the things that were important to me. But I think you're your question is spot on. That is the key weakness of the virtual interview process relative to the in-person interview.
I agree. It's definitely one of the harder areas to convey in a virtual interview. And I would look at the programs that are really making an effort in that direction. I think it should be a red flag if you're not able to meet with residents, fellows, other trainees outside the view of faculty, so to speak. If you don't have a breakout room where you're talking with them in between interviews, or have something formal where you have a formal time block where it's just you and the current trainees of the program. It's incredibly important to see how you fit with that group, because they're going to be people that you spend as much or more time with than even your family over the next couple of years of your life. And they'll really show you the culture of the program. One thing we did during the MD Anderson interviews is we provided people with contact information for the trainees as well, so they could talk to them afterwards, or if other questions came up when they went on later interviews. I think it's perfectly acceptable to communicate with the program and say, hey, I have some additional questions that I didn't get answered while I was there. These are what they are, if they're questions for the program themselves, or if you want to speak to one of the residents or one of the trainees, asking for contact information for one of them. And the programs should be happy to answer those questions or supply you with that information. Again, to me, it would be a red flag if a program said, no, you can't learn more about the program, or you can't talk to our trainees outside the purview of this highly structured and choreographed thing that we've set up. So it's important to remember those things as well.
I mean, it really is about, fit, like everything we're talking about, and how do you find the fit in the virtual world? I think everybody has the opportunity to meet with the residents or the fellows during sort of the interview session. But what we want to do is, we want to see what you're like in a sort of like a informal session. So one of the things that we did was we set up a sort of like a happy hour with the applicants and just the fellows, and they can, they got to make some mixed drinks and stuff. And we wanted to see, are they, what are they like, outside of sort of the formal interview session, just to get a better sense of, who you are as an applicant.
Perfect. It's 7:18, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time this evening. So we'll conclude our SSAT webinar on tips for virtual interviewing. There were a few questions we couldn't get to, but I invite everyone to reach out to the panelists and connect with any questions at all. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. McKinley, Dr. Day, and Dr. Tsung for their expertise and time, and everyone out there for taking the time to log in and being so engaging. I especially want to thank our Director of Administration, LK, who is the glue that holds our society and community together behind the scenes and made all this possible. And of course, our community chair, Dr. Maria Altieri, for her support and leadership. Have a good evening, everyone.